And thank you to all the participants of this webinar. What we're going to talk about this morning is software estimating in the context of bidding software projects. And specifically what we're talking to is the notion of adding some realism to the process of bidding software. There's a lot of things that are involved in responding to an RFP or in developing a bid for a software project. There's a lot of different things that go into that, and one of the things that we find often doesn't go into that is realism or reality. There's often a lot more attention focused on winning a software contract than on creating a bid that's going to lead to a successful software project. So that's what we'll talk about today. And I'll briefly go over the agenda. First, an introduction of what is the problem, why do we care about realism with our software bids, and what goes wrong with software bids. What are companies doing that are leading to these software disasters that we hear about in the news? Then we'll talk a little bit about adding realism and what are some of the responsible actions for both the buyers of software, people who are issuing contracts to develop software, and the bidders or the vendors. And then we'll wrap it up and take your questions. So I guess we all know that software projects fail. And, one of the reasons that you're probably attending this morning is because either you are a bidder on software projects and you want to add some realism to those bids, or you may be a vendor and you want to know or a buyer, and what can a buyer do to help. But we know that software projects fail. That's why we're all here. According to the 2009 Chaos report by Standish, only 32% of projects are considered successful. Now, in the context of this report, if you're not familiar with the report, they categorize projects in one of three ways. Successful, which means it fully meets its requirements and is done on time and on schedule. Challenged means that one or more of those things doesn't happen. And failure is a failure. It either doesn't ever get done, or the requirements aren't satisfactorily met, or it takes a lot longer and costs a lot more than originally predicted. There was also a study in IEEE software that says that 26 to 34% of projects are unsuccessful or are canceled before they're completed. Excuse me. Both of these studies use different definitions of unsuccessful or canceled, and I know the Chaos study has been, criticized in I think, in fact, in the IEEE software report that I referenced on my slide. But in both send a disturbing message that we are, as an industry, as a software industry, are failing to learn adequately from our history. Failed contract development does further complicate this, because if the software is being developed organically and in-house, the software projects still fail in those circumstances, but you add an additional level of abstraction when you're contracting out for your software. So these failures can result certainly in damaged reputations, in battles between the vendor and the buyer. They can actually result in litigation in some cases. A report I read by DeMarco and Lister says that as much as 5% of software projects actually end up in litigation. And, occasionally you'll see this in the news, although I found lots of reports of litigation regarding software and software contracts and bids gone bad. Lots of reports of the existence of this litigation. I could find very little evidence of how these of what the outcomes of this litigation was, presumably because they dealt with large the buyer was a large company, very well known. The sellers or the vendors were large companies that were well known, and my guess is that it wouldn't be in either's best interest to air their dirty laundry in the media, and the settlements that come out of these litigations are kept under the covers. But it is interesting to note that DeMarco reports up to 5% of all software contracts end up in litigation. Other things go wrong. Projects get canceled because of overruns or because important schedule milestones are met. Certainly when you bid a software contract, or when you're purchasing software that someone else is building for you, you need that software for a specific purpose. And if for example, the purpose is to help fulfill a market need, and you miss that window of opportunity, the project gets canceled. But these cancellations or project failures tend to be costly to both the buyer and the vendor. It's really not it's really a lose-lose situation when software contract bids go bad. They can be prevented if bidders are using good bidding practices and if bidders and vendors work together to make the project successful. So let's talk a little bit about the software bidding process, and clearly a simplification. But, you know, a business leader has a good idea. Wouldn't it be great if we could develop software that would automate all the cash registers and all the Kmarts all over the world and have them talk to each other? I don't know if that would really be good, but it's a requirement. It's a good idea. And they take that good idea and they translate it into generally some top-level requirements or use cases, you know, enough that they can communicate to potential software developers, here's the software that I want. Here's the software that I want built. Here's the software that I am willing to pay a certain amount for. These requirements are then issued to the potential bidders. The bidders do analysis of the requirements depending on, you know, the type of contract it is and whether there's regulations around it. There may be some back and forth discussion. There may not be a lot of back and forth discussion. But the software developers develop requirements. They look at those requirements, and internally they say, these are the requirements that we think will satisfy the buyer. They hopefully confirm that information with the buyer, and then they need to perform a cost estimate. What is it going to cost us to develop in software these requirements? And based on what it's going to cost us, how can we reasonably price this software development so that we get it done, and we make money? Now, hopefully what's going on is during this process is not just requirements get thrown over the wall to the bidders. The bidders sit down and look at what they think the requirements are and create a cost estimate based on that. Hopefully there's back and forth validation, clarification. There's discussion and communication between the bidder and the buyer. And this is very important because the buyer needs software. The bidder wants to build software, and in almost every case, the buyer needs the software and is willing to pay a fair price for it. The bidder wants the work and intends to do a quality job. But if discussion doesn't start early on, there's lots and lots of places where that there can be a breakdown between those two things, and both the buyer and the bidder end up unhappy. Clearly, good software cost estimates or effort estimates are a crucial part of getting the price right. If the cost estimate is too low, obviously the bidder could lose money. The bidder could end up in order to satisfy the requirements of the contract, the bidder could end up finishing at a loss. The bidder may not be able to finish the job. If the bidder is a small software company, they could potentially go out of business because they don't have the capital to successfully meet the contract requirements. And certainly